Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
The podcast you're about to hear is true. The names have not been changed to protect the innocent, the guilty, or anyone else. If you're interested in the same type of discussion related to organized crime that you hear in the traditional media, stop listening now. If you're interested in thinking differently or learning something, turn up the volume on your computer, smartphone, or mobile device. This is The Racket Report. Here's Frank Morano.
This is The Racket Report. I'm Frank Morano. Welcome to the podcast that tries to take you inside the world of organized crime from every perspective, from a journalist perspective, a criminal perspective, and a law enforcement perspective. I am really excited about the story that we get to tell you today, not because it's a particularly good story, but because it is masterfully told, and it deals with the worlds of both law enforcement and criminality and where they intersect. A lot of you will remember the Mafia Cops case, a fascinating case that not only caught the attention of New Yorkers, but people around the country, maybe even around the world. It's been almost 20 years since they were convicted. If you don't remember exactly what happened, basically, this was a story of two NYPD police officers who were moonlighting for the mob, running errands, giving information, even carrying out murders. And it wasn't until after they retired that they were arrested and convicted. Well, I thought I knew about this case. I attended the trial. I know many of the attorneys involved. I know a lot of the other witnesses involved. After reading the book I'm about to tell you about, I realized I knew nothing. I knew nothing. Not only did this book blow the lid off of everything you ever wanted to know about the Mafia Cops, but was afraid to ask, it also provides an incredibly colorful backdrop of what mafia-like life was like in New York City in the late 70s and the 80s. The book is called Blood and the Badge: The Mafia, Two Killer Cops, and a Scandal That Shocked the Nation. Its author is Michael Cannell, a former editor at the New York Times and a best-selling author. Michael, congratulations on the book. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Frank, and thank you for those generous words.
I can tell how much work you put into this. I can only imagine how much time you put into this. If we can kind of go backwards before we get into the chronology of what happened with Eppolito and Caracappa, what sparked your interest in this case? Clearly, you've written about a lot of different things before, both criminal and otherwise. Why this specific case? Why was it worthy of your time and attention?
Yeah, I had written about a bunch of different things. My previous book was called A Brotherhood Betrayed. It was about Murder Incorporated, the assassination arm of the mafia in the 30s and the 40s. You're well acquainted with that crew. That was a period when organized crime became organized. In a way, this book is a bookend to that. This is the 1980s and 90s when organized crime became disorganized. I was vaguely aware of this story. I was kind of scouting the landscape for another topic that was worthy of a book, and I started to gather string on this story of two corrupt cops who were moonlighting for the mob. As you mentioned, I mean, it wasn't a secret. It had been written about before. It had been covered by the New York Post and the Daily News. I did feel like it would be possible to write a big, ambitious book on this topic since a little bit of time had passed. And I think that panned out. I think that turned out to be true, largely because the investigators, the FBI agents, the prosecutors, the detectives who had worked on this case they were willing to talk to me about it after a little time had passed. They wouldn't have talked to me about it 10 years ago or 15 years ago. But now the two cops in question have passed away. The people who investigated them are retired. And so they began to talk to me, and the stories just came out, one unbelievable story after another. And so I was the lucky recipient of this secret history about this episode, which many people have called the worst case of police corruption in New York history, if not American history.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a lot of folks that would dispute that. All right, for people that don't know the story, let's go back in time in looking at each of the people involved. Eppolito and Caracappa, namely. Now, I first became aware of Louis Eppolito in the early 90s when I saw him on the Richard Bay Show on an episode with Bruce Cutler and Curtis Sliwa and his mother, when he had just written a memoir called Mafia Cop. This was around 1992. We can get into the psychology of why someone that's a cop doing illegal things would try to bring attention to themselves with a memoir and a media tour. But in that book and in the media tour surrounding that book, Eppolito basically told a story about how he came from a mafia family, how his dad was a gangster. He had an uncle that was a gangster, probably others, and how he kind of overcame that to be a fighter for good and fight for the cause of law enforcement. Obviously, without the ending of my description just now, how much of that story is true? Did Eppolito, in fact, come from a mafia background? And what do we know about his family history?
Well, that family history is probably the only thing in his book that is true. He did come from a mafia family. His father, as I'm sure you know, was a capo in the Gambino crime family. He was called Fat the Gangster. And his uncle was also a capo, and he was known as Jimmy the Clam. His father was, no surprise, an abusive character, and Louis Eppolito grew up in an abusive, violent household. Weeks after his father died of a heart attack, Eppolito joined the police academy. He enlisted in the NYPD. Nobody could believe that he would do that. I mean, it was traitorous in his world to join the police department. And he went on to become a pretty good cop. I mean, he earned accolades in the police department, and he was promoted. He became a detective, but as is often the case, his family reeled him back in, right? It's hard to escape your bloodlines. It's hard to escape your family. And before long, he and his best friend and partner in the police department were working for the mafia, and they were paid a $4,000 a month retainer to pass information along to the Lucchese crime family.
So let's talk about that partner, Caracappa. Unlike Eppolito, did Caracappa have any sort of mafia history in his family background?
He didn't. He had been charged with a felony as a teenager. He had been caught loading stolen goods into a rented truck as a teenager. The charges were dismissed. He went to Vietnam. He came back from Vietnam. He joined the police department at the same time as Eppolito. You know, you think to yourself, how could the police have hired these two guys? I think the answer is that in 1969, the NYPD was desperate to hire anybody who could lace up a pair of boots and walk the street. This was the time when the Vietnam draft was depleting the ranks. And so whether the police knew about their respective histories or not, it's really hard to know. But they were willing to overlook them in order to hire them. You know, like a lot of partnerships, Eppolito and Caracappa were exact opposite opposites of each other. Ippolito was a loud, boorish, unkempt character, and Caracappa was the opposite. He was quiet to the point of being almost mute and would show up for work impeccably tailored. They were opposites, but they somehow managed to work as partners for a couple of decades, not just passing information along to the mob, but in some cases facilitating murders for the mob, more than a dozen murders. And in at least one case, they pulled the trigger themselves.
So I want to get into what they actually did and what we know about their crimes. You described them as a kind of an odd couple style partnership. Were they actually partners in the police sense? Were they actually partners, and how long were they partners for?
Yeah, they were partners in the robbery squad in Brooklyn South early in their careers when they were both young detectives. And there's a kind of an odd episode in which, after they were paired up, Caracappa went to their boss and said, "I can't work with this guy. Who is this guy?" And the boss said, "Give it a month. If you still feel like you can't work with him, come back to me." Caracappa never came back. They were partners for some years. And it's hard to imagine what conversations might have gone on between the two of them, but they entered into this alliance in which they were working for the mafia long after they, in fact, had been reassigned to different posts.
In terms of that partnership, did your research indicate that they were both bad guys from the very beginning, or was there a point in their police work that they broke bad, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't know that I can answer it without trying to psychoanalyze them a little bit. I think Louis Ippolito, as I mentioned, he rebelled against his family by joining the police department. In his mind, was he a cop who was masquerading as a mafiosi, or was he a mafiosi who was masquerading as a cop? I'm not sure, and I don't think he was sure either. I think these things were mixed up in his head. Stephen Caracappa was entirely different because he didn't come from a mafia background. He had criminal instincts, but he didn't come from a mafia background. I think on some level they felt like they were doing this for money, but I also think in Caracappa's case, I think he liked having this secret life. I think he liked pulling one over on people.
So good, so good, so good.
Great brands, great prices. Everyone's got a reason to rack.
You know they have Marc Jacobs?
Nike? Yes.
Just so many good brands.
Vince, Birkenstock, and more brands you love are at Nordstrom Rack stores now. Plus, buy it online and pick it up in-store the same day for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you rack.
Ready to make a real impact every day? Join the Active Day Home Care team and help clients maintain their independence in the comfort of their own homes. Make a difference in someone's life as you provide essential daily assistance and protect their health and happiness. Earn up to $20 an hour and enjoy additional perks like optional daily pay, 401k, paid time off, ongoing educational training, and more. Join a team that values care, compassion, and your professional growth. Visit ActiveDay.com to apply.
You anticipated my next question, which is the why. You alluded to the $4,000 a month retainer that they were paid. Was it only about money, or was there something else? It sounds like, at least in Caracappa's case, there was a little bit of a thrill in terms of leading this double life.
I think there was a thrill and a sort of smug sense of superiority in leading this double life. And in Ippolito's case, it may have been that he grew up in a world in which The mafia was stature. The mafia, his father was a capo, which meant he was the boss of his own crew. And so Ippolito probably associated the mafia with a certain stature. In, the neighborhood mafia guys, they were treated with respect. When they went into a restaurant, they got a table immediately. So I think he was, I think in his mind, the mafia meant that you were a big guy.
In terms of what the work they actually did was and for whom, you mentioned that $4,000 a month retainer from the Lucchese's, especially in the 70s and early 80s. That was a lot of money, especially on a police officer's salary. Did they exclusively work for the Lucchese's? I know Ippolito's father was a gangster with the Gambino family, but as far as their moonlighting for the mob, were they exclusive to the Lucchese family?
Yeah, they actually worked for an intermediary. A drug dealer wouldn't be the right word. He was a sort of drug lord called Bert Kaplan. And Bert Kaplan hired them, and then, he acted as the go-between. And then the work that they did went via Bert Kaplan to the mafia. And Bert Kaplan kept all of this very carefully compartmentalized in case somebody flipped so that nobody could implicate anybody else. So they were paid this retainer to provide this information, and then they were paid a bonus for the murder part of it. They were, as I mentioned, they were facilitating the murders of informants.
What exactly did they do? When you say I know you mentioned they pulled the trigger at least once. Which murder was that they were the actual hitmen for? And when they facilitated the murders of informants, what did that entail? Did it entail informing about who was informing? Did it entail giving information about the whereabouts of known informants? What was the totality of the work that they did for the Lucchese's?
Well, one of the things that their patron in the Lucchese family was interested in doing was avenging an assassination attempt on him. He was eating an ice cream cone outside of a strip mall near his Mill Basin, Brooklyn home when a car pulled up and fired on him. He escaped. He ran into a restaurant and escaped. But he spent a lot of time trying to figure out who ordered that killing and why and who was involved. And these two corrupt cops were critical to doing that. And so after Stephen Caracappa left the Brooklyn South precinct, he was working in the major case squad in police headquarters. Not only that, but he was the point man there for all of the paperwork and information. So he knew absolutely everything about the big city investigations, not just in the police department, but in the FBI. And so he was able to pass along to Gaspard Casso this information about who was an informant, who was involved in this assassination attempt, what their address was, the details of how they might pursue them and kill them.
Wow. And which was the murder where they were the trigger men for?
They murdered a capo named Eddie Lino, and they followed him on his way home to Long Island. They trailed him on the Belt Parkway. They pulled him over with police lights and shot him right on the side of the Belt Parkway, which is, it's surprising because they were in full view of everybody driving by. Normally you would expect these things to be done in a very careful and secretive manner, but they did that right on the side of the Belt Parkway. It's very likely that they pulled the trigger in other murders. They were once seen unloading a body from a car in a kind of no man's land between the Belt Parkway and Jamaica Bay. Nobody has really uncovered that story yet.
Why were they the trigger men there in the Eddie Leno case rather than, as they typically were, giving this information and aiding in the murder to others?
Well, there were times when Gaspipe Queso felt like his own men were less reliable. I mean, as Rudy Giuliani closed in on the mafia using the RICO laws to bust the mob, more and more of the kind of middle management of the mafia was flipping. And for their own safety and protection, they were going to the government and making deals. And Casso began to not trust his own people. And so he turned to these two cops to do the dirty work that he might otherwise have doled out to his own men. In one case, he called on them to abduct somebody, a young man named Jimmy Heidel, who had been involved in this assassination attempt on Gaspipe Casso. The cops were very willing to kill Jimmy Heidel, but Gaspipe wanted them to deliver Jimmy to him so that he could interrogate Jimmy himself. And that's exactly what he did. He took Jimmy Heidel to the basement of a friend's basement, and really the word is torture. He tortured him and extracted as much information from him as he could.
Wow. In terms of what they actually did, so about how long, as far as your research suggests, were they on the payroll of the Lucchese family?
Well, more than a decade. I mean, they were doing this for a long time, and they eventually retired. They got full police pensions, and they moved to Las Vegas. Oddly enough, they moved to houses across the street from each other in a subdivision on the outskirts of Las Vegas, and I think they felt like they had gotten away with it.
Sure.
Eppolito launched into a kind of a minor movie career. He had cameo roles in a dozen movies. Most notably, he had a very small role in Goodfellas. And I think he thought he could parlay his tough guy Brooklyn demeanor into an acting career.
I want to come back to that in a second, but I guess the $1 million question, the question that everybody asks when they read headlines about this case is, how did no one catch them? I mean, there had to be people that knew, both in law enforcement circles and in underworld circles, what these guys were up to. How did this never result in an arrest until after they were retired?
Early on in Eppolito's career with the mafia, the police raided the home of a Gambino heroin dealer, Rosario Gambino, in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And in Gambino's home, they found that Gambino had in his possession his own police file. So obviously somebody passed that to him. Eppolito's fingerprints were found on that file. Eppolito went before a trial in Internal Affairs, and unbelievably, Internal Affairs dismissed the case. He was acquitted. Now, why did that happen? Hard to say exactly, but my best guess would be that the police was weary of scandal, weary of corruption scandals and headlines in the years after the Knapp Commission, and so they swept it under the rug. Years later, their mafia patron, Gaspipe Casso, himself flipped and became an informant, and he told the FBI about Eppolito and Caracappa. Seems like an open and shut case, right? What happened is that Gaspipe Casso began bad-mouthing other informants, most notably Sammy the Bull Gravano. And the federal prosecutors didn't like that because these other Gravano and the other witnesses in the big mob trials were critically important to them. So gas pipe became kind of radioactive and toxic. So they ripped up his plea agreement and sent him to supermax prison. So who was the beneficiary of that? Well, Eppolito and Caracappa, because now there was nobody to testify against them. So the federal prosecutors made a strategic decision. Better to protect the marquee witnesses like Sammy the Bull Gravano, who helped them put John Gotti in prison. Better to protect Gravano than to let Gas Pipe testify against Eppolito and Caracappa. So at this point, they appear to have gotten away with it. Kind of, it's incredible to say it, but the FBI knew what these two cops had done and kind of walked away from it.
The question that I guess, I alluded to before in terms of just being flabbergasted at how someone that literally got away with murder would, instead of lead a life outside of the public spotlight and try to eschew any sort of attention, I'm just blown away that Eppolito would go the opposite way. Eppolito didn't just write a book and do a media tour. As you pointed out, he was trying to be an actor. He was trying to be a screenwriter. Why in the world would someone that got away with murder and got away with moonlighting for the mob while being a cop, why would they seek any sort of attention in the public eye?
I mean, I think that's exactly the right question. And it was the same question that his partner, Stephen Caracappa, asked and the intermediary, Bert Kaplan, asked. They were, infuriated that Eppolito would do this. And what's more, he published a photo of himself and Caracappa in the book. That was a critical mistake because now people who might have encountered them in the course of their nefarious activities could identify them and would know their names. And that's exactly what happened. The mother of Jimmy Heidel, the young man who was tortured to death, Eppolito and Caracappa had come to the family home looking for Jimmy. Their mother, Betty, saw Eppolito on the Sally Jesse Raphael talk show promoting this book. She recognized Eppolito from the day he had come looking for Jimmy. She went out and got the book. And now she knew Eppolito's name, and she knew Stephen Caracappa's name. And that was really the beginning of the end for them.
How did this case get brought to life? You spent a lot of time chronicling the work of an NYPD detective by the name of Tommy Dades. Who's Tommy Dades? When did he realize that there might have been something amiss here? And how did this end up materializing into an indictment and then obviously a conviction?
Tommy Dades was an NYPD detective in the intelligence division. He'd had a long, storied career as a detective. He'd done just about everything imaginable, had been through many grisly episodes. He was winding down his career when he received a phone call from Betty Heidel, the woman that I mentioned a few moments ago. So Betty, after buying Eppolito's book, Betty figured out who Eppolito and Caracappa who they were and what they were up to. She didn't really trust the FBI, but she trusted Tommy Dades. Tommy Dades had worked on the murder of her other son, Frankie. So she knew Tommy. Now, Tommy is the son of a single mother. Tommy always had a special relationship with the mothers in the cases that he worked on, the mothers of the perpetrators, the mothers of the victims. He ran errands for them. He sent them Christmas cards. He helped them to navigate the judicial system. They trusted him. And Betty Heidel trusted Tommy with this information. So she called Tommy and told him about these two men that had come looking for her son and who they were. Tommy in turn took that information to the Brooklyn DA's office. The Brooklyn DA's office asked Tommy to investigate, and Tommy really built the case that the federal prosecutors had abandoned years earlier.
Wow. I mean, that's pretty impressive on his part. And I'm glad that he's getting the recognition in your book that he deserves. Did you attend the trial at all? And if not attend, how closely did you follow the trial when it was going on?
No, I wish I had attended the trial. The trial was in 2006, and I didn't start working on this until 5 years ago. So the trial was long over, but I did read the transcripts over and over again. And, for anybody who's writing a book like this, the trials are fascinating because all the characters come together and they sit in one room. The families of the victims and the perpetrators are sitting in awkward proximity to each other, and one person after another takes the stand, and more or less the truth comes out. And so for that reason, to read the testimony was fascinating. To hear the participants tell the story in their own words was like watching a movie.
What would you say were the highlights and or lowlights of the trial? What were the marquee moments that really stood out based on your reading of the transcripts?
Well, tragically, some of the information that Ippolito and Caracappa passed along to the mafia was not correct in a couple of cases, and in one instance, the mafia was looking to kill a man named Nicky Guido, who was part of the assassination attempt on Gaspar Picasso. And Ippolito and Caracappa passed along information about Nicky Guido, and the mafia soldiers came and shot Nicky Guido on Christmas Day outside of his family home. But it turned out it was not the right Nicky Guido. It was a different Nicky Guido. And in the middle of that trial, Nicky Guido's mother came and walked up to the witness stand and told her story about that Christmas Day. And I think there was not a sound in that courtroom. Probably it was heart-wrenching.
Yeah, no doubt about it. One of the moments that was somewhat controversial post-conviction is that there was a judge that actually vacated the conviction or the sentence of the mafia cops before that sentence was reinstated. What happened there? What went on with that temporary vacating of that conviction?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. So after all of this had occurred, after Ippolito and Caracappa appeared to get away with this, and then Tommy Dades built a case against them, they were convicted. As you say, the judge, a legendary judge named Jack Weinstein, threw the conviction out on a technicality. The technicality was this: they were convicted on a RICO charge, and RICO comes with a time limit, a statute of limitations. And he felt that the statute of limitations had been had expired. What happened was that Ippolito and Caracappa were arrested on a drug charge in Las Vegas. And Judge Weinstein's feeling was that really wasn't part of this conspiracy. That was a kind of separate event. Fortunately, as you say, the higher court, the appeals court, reinstated the conviction.
What was the basis for the appeals court to reinstate a conviction if Judge Weinstein had found that 5 year statute of limitations had elapsed?
Well, part of what's kind of slightly technical here, but interesting, is that people involved in the case feel that Judge Weinstein ruled in this manner after the conviction, so that the appeals court could overturn it.
I see.
He might simply have ruled on this at the beginning of the trial or before the trial, and then there would never have been a trial. So the appeals court had the opportunity to examine this, and they simply didn't agree with Judge Weinstein. They felt that it was legitimate to take all of their activities, including the drug sale in Las Vegas, as part of the same conspiracy.
Tell me about Louis Eppolito's daughter, Andrea.
Louis Eppolito has a daughter named Andrea, who was really his advocate before, during, and after the trial. I never met her or spoke to her, but I sensed that she was a charismatic presence, and she daily during the trial would stand in Cadman Plaza outside of the courthouse and advocate for her father. She really stuck up for her father. And part of the untold story about all of this is that her half-brother, Lou Jr., Louis Eppolito's son from a previous marriage, would go to the trial every single day with his partner, and he did not express sympathy for his father. He went to determine for himself if his father was guilty or not. And so the courtroom was kind of charged with this sense of animosity between Eppolito's son from his first marriage and his children from his second marriage.
Yeah, I actually met his son. I don't remember if that was at that trial or another trial that I was covering. And I didn't get the sense that he had very much sympathy at all for what his father was accused of doing. This is such an incredible story, as you chronicle in this book, Blood and the Badge, and I want to encourage people to absolutely check it out. Has there ever been a good movie about the Mafia Cops case?
Not yet. I think there is a movie which is in production, which is very vaguely based on this case, and I don't think they even use the perpetrators' names. I don't really know anything about it. I know that it's out there, but the big movie on this case, I think, has never been made, but it's a cinematic story, and I hope it will be made. Yeah,
I mean, your book provides a great template for doing that. One of these sort of corollaries, again, there's so many interesting little tangents in mafia history that you chronicle in this book just by telling the story of Eppolito and Caracappa. One of the interesting tidbits about this is you talk about Paul Castellano, who was the former boss of the Gambino crime family, who was obviously murdered and paved the way for John Gotti. And apparently Paul Castellano had some concerns that Angelo Ruggiero, who in addition to being a very close friend of John Gotti and the godfather of John Gotti Jr., and that's where John Gotti Jr. gets his middle name from, Angelo, that he was actually an informant. Is that true? Do we have any idea if Ruggiero was an informant? And if he wasn't, why was Castellano of the view that he may have been?
It's very hard to know. I mean, and some of these things are hard to pinpoint because the mafia, of course, keeps its own history, right? It's not, but it's hard to know what's true and what isn't true. Was Ruggiero an informant? Was that simply an accusation that was being pinned on him as an excuse to get rid of him? I think really impossible to know.
You spoke with Sammy Gravano for this book. What was it like to interview him? What did he have to add in terms of your understanding of the story?
Well, as you know, Sammy, like a good number of prominent underworld figures, it now has a podcast, a very popular podcast, and so Sammy is a kind of historian of all of this. And I wanted to talk to him about a number of the things in this book, and I found him to be very serious-minded and upfront and candid.
So what was it about their aspect of the story, Ippolito and Caracappa, that you found Gravano to be particularly knowledgeable about?
Well, I mean, I don't know that Sammy cast any particular light on this, but at one point, Gaspar Casso had hired the detectives to kill Gravano. Mm-hmm. They followed him around and, in fact, had staked out his office and he owned a bar in Brooklyn, and they were intending to assassinate him. And it just so happened that an acquaintance of theirs, another cop, came up and said, "What are you two doing here?" And that kind of scared him off. So there's a lot of history there that Gravano that he knew about, and the cops certainly knew a lot about Gravano, and he knew a lot about them.
Obviously the mafia is sort of a different world today than it was in the 1980s. Ippolito and Caracappa were described as the Lucchese family's early warning system. How instrumental were they in shaping the mafia's survival, or at least the Lucchese family's survival, during a time when law enforcement was beginning, under people like Rudy Giuliani and others, to use RICO statutes effectively?
I mean, I think that's a really good question. This was a time when the mafia was unraveling, not just because of the RICO laws, but because of greed. It was so much of the mafia was about selling drugs at that time, and there was an enormous amount of money flooding into the mafia, and a new generation of mafiosi who didn't particularly adhere to the old rules of the mafia. They were more out for themselves. And so the mafia had become undisciplined. And because of the sentencing guidelines that went along with the RICO laws, people could be put away for long periods of time. And they were just not willing to face that. And so one by one, these middle management figures made deals with prosecutors, and a lot of them became informants and went into the witness protection program. And so for somebody like Gaspar Casso, these two cops were a lifeline. They were a way to protect themselves. Gaspar Casso, thanks to their services, knew who the informants were, and he knew who was under investigation.
Really just interesting stuff. And again, I want to remind folks, the book is called Blood and the Badge. We've been talking with its author, Michael Cannell. Michael, you've conducted interviews with sources who previously remained silent. What was the most surprising or shocking revelation that you uncovered during your research?
Oh gosh, I don't know if I can pinpoint a single episode, but the detectives who talked to me, who had never talked to me before, just talked to people before, it was just. I mean, you maybe have to look at the book. Honestly, it's just one incredible story after another. There's a detective named Frank Pergola who investigated what's known as the DeMeo crew. And the DeMeo crew was essentially they were like a dozen serial killers in a mafia crew out in Brooklyn. And Frank Pergola flipped one of their members, and he had this former DeMeo crew member in a trailer, safely tucked away in a trailer up by Lake George in upstate New York. And then one day he gets a frantic call from the FBI saying, get out of there, get out of there immediately. And what happened was that Stephen Caracappa had determined who the informant was and where they were. And so Detective Frank Pergola knew that the mafia was coming up. They were coming up to get them. And so he fled with the informant. And, that's a story I don't think anybody has ever told before, but it's one episode after another like that.
Obviously, this story explores a time of widespread mob paranoia and infighting, a big difference to what we see today where there's a diminished mafia presence. How has organized crime evolved since the events in your book?
Well, I drove around Bensonhurst with a former Colombo hitman, and we talked about this as we drove around Bensonhurst. We stopped at the Cafe Italia, an old wise guy hangout, and we drank espresso. And I asked him about this, and he said the wise guys are still out here. I think they're running loan sharking operations and gambling operations. But they're not menacing in quite the same way. Why not? I mean, part of the reason, according to the detective that I spoke to, part of the reason simply is because the city is now blanketed by security cameras. Their stock in trade was abduction, street shooting. Those things are very hard to pull off when you're on camera. So I think the mafia is still out there. They just operate in a less visible way, and I don't think that explicit violence is part of what they do so much anymore.
Lastly, when writing about real people, even villains, I'm wondering if there's any part of you that empathizes with any aspect of their humanity. Clearly, Andrea Ippolito seemed to still love her father, even after the evidence of him being a real villain. Is there any part of you in which you recognize some of their humanity, or do their crimes totally overshadow any attempt to understand them as complex individuals?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think that for many or most of these characters that we're talking about, not Ippolito and Caracappa, but many or most of the wise guys, they were born into this life. And once they were in it, they were seduced into it because the mafia guys they were the big shots in their neighborhood, and it was the big game in town. But once they were in it, they couldn't get out of it. And those that did get out of it paid the price for it. So I do feel empathy for them. I think for a lot of these guys, it was like being drafted into the army. You might kill if you were in the army, but you felt like that was your job. I'm not trying to excuse what they did, but I don't, they were part of a system that they were born into. And if you think of it that way, they are almost victims as well as perpetrators.
Michael Cannell, we're going to have to end it there. Congratulations again on the book. It's terrific, and I hope everybody reads it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your interest in this.
Thank you. If you want to offer any feedback in terms of our discussion, you're welcome to email me. My email is frank.morano@wabcradio.com. That's frank.morano@wabcradio.com. If somebody sent you this podcast, or if you discovered it on social media, please do us a favor and share it and forward it to a friend. And you could also subscribe to the podcast. Just search The Racket Report on any podcast app. Until the next time we meet in the podcast world, I'll see you on the radio.
Americans love using their credit cards, the most secure and hassle-free way to pay. But DC politicians want to change that with the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill. This bill lets corporate megastores pick how your credit card is processed, allowing them to use untested payment networks that jeopardize your data security and rewards. Corporate megastores will make more money, and you pay the price. Tell Congress to guard your card, because Americans lose when politicians choose. Learn more at guardyourcard.com.